Energy flow in ecosystems. In this lesson, we're talking about photosynthesis, cellular respiration, ecological niche, producers and consumers, herbivores, omnivores and carnivores, scavengers, food chain, trophic levels, food webs, and ecological pyramids. Earth's energy budget. This diagram shows you how energy is consumed and used by the things on Earth. So energy coming in from the sun is going to be this block right here, this large one here. It's going to come in, and 30% of it is going to be reflected by clouds or the Earth's surface, and then 19% is going to be absorbed by the atmosphere and clouds. So right off the bat, we're going to lose 49%. That leaves us with 51%. Out of that 51%, a tiny fraction is absorbed by plants, and the rest is absorbed by the land and oceans. In this lesson, we're mostly going to be talking about this 0.023% that's absorbed by plants, because that's going to be an important part of photosynthesis. From photosynthesis, we're going to be able to make glucose, which we can use to make energy. Photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is a process where the sun's energy is converted to chemical energy, glucose and sugar. It occurs in plants, which are producers, and a producer is an organism that makes its own energy-rich food compounds using the sun's energy. So if you make glucose using photosynthesis, you are a producer. On land, the major producers are green plants, which contain a compound called chlorophyll inside their chloroplasts that capture light energy and create sugar from it. And here's the equation for photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide plus water plus light energy is going to give us sugar and oxygen. So you've heard of plants making oxygen. That's this part of the equation. The other major part of what plants do is they make sugar. Now, it's not just sugar that you might find in candy. It's other kind of sugar too. Think of sugar from carbohydrates, but also think of sugar in terms of a building block that we can use to make many other things. It's pretty much the starting point of all food stuff. Now, here's a diagram of the process. So we have that sunlight that we were talking about, the carbon dioxide that's floating around in the air, and then water. And from that, plants are going to take those three things in and make oxygen for us to breathe, and sugars that we can use for energy. And that brings us to cellular respiration, which is the opposite of photosynthesis. Sugar is converted into carbon dioxide, water, and energy. The organism uses the energy to do everything. Producers, plants, and consumers, animals that eat the producers, undergo cellular respiration. So plants make the sugar, but then they also undergo cellular respiration as well. They need to produce their own energy to keep themselves alive. So you can see why we say it's the opposite of photosynthesis. If you take a look at this equation, it's carbon dioxide plus water plus light energy gives you sugar and oxygen. Cellular respiration is going to be the opposite. Sugar plus oxygen. So this is why we breathe, the oxygen here. The sugar is what we take in our food. And then we're going to breathe out carbon dioxide. We're going to create water. And then we're going to create energy as well. This energy allows us to do stuff. Everything from breathing to walking. Everything comes from this creation of energy right here. And as I just said, if you look closely at the equations, you'll notice that the things that are made in photosynthesis are consumed in cellular respiration. So the oxygen and sugar that are made in photosynthesis at the top are going to be used in cellular respiration at the bottom. The things that are made in cellular respiration on the bottom, carbon dioxide, water, are going to be used as a reactant in the photosynthesis equation. The only addition is this light energy, and that's going to come in from the sun. So what is created in one reaction is used in the other. And this picture represents this as well. So photosynthesis is going to create our oxygen, and that's sugar. And following photosynthesis, the thing that does the cellular respiration is the mitochondria. The mitochondria is going to create carbon dioxide and water, and it's going to create this chemical energy, also known as ATP. So many organisms cannot photosynthesize, and they are called consumers. I cannot photosynthesize, and neither can you. Consumers are organisms that obtain their energy from consuming other organisms. So if you are not a producer, you are a consumer, because you need to get your sugar from somewhere to create your energy through cellular respiration. Therefore, we completely rely on the sun. If we're not a producer, we're a consumer who eats the producer, or we eat another consumer that ate a producer at one point in time. So no matter what, everything always comes back to the sun. For this diagram to occur, this light energy needs to be present. If we were to get rid of this light energy, then photosynthesis stops, and if photosynthesis stops, cellular respiration stops. So no sun equals no photosynthesis, which equals no food for plants, which equals no food for animals, which equals no food for larger animals. No sun equals no life on Earth. And this is the basis behind the dinosaur extinction. What is thought that happened is that a huge asteroid hit Earth near Mexico, which sent up so much dust and debris that actually blocked the sun for many years. It stopped the majority of photosynthesis from happening, which killed off a lot of the plant life, which made it so there was less food for the consumers, which made it so there was less food for the things that ate the other consumers, and so all the way up the food chain, eventually killing off a good portion of the population, including most of the dinosaurs that were present at that time. And you can see it hit right here. That's Mexico. This would be Florida. That would be the United States right there. And that brings us to our food chain. Our food chains are a sequence of organisms which each feed on the next. And it shows how energy is transferred from one organism to the other. We talked about how producers produce the sugar, which is then passed on to the consumers, which is then passed on to the thing that eats the initial consumer, and so on. The arrow points to the consumer. So in this case, the pine cone is going to be eaten by the red squirrel. The sugar that was made in the pine cone is going to be passed to the red squirrel, which is then going to pass it to the weasel, who is going to eat the squirrel, and so on. Food chains do not really exist in nature. They're simply good for showing feeding relationships on a micro scale. So what I'd like you to do now is pause the video and try it. I'd like you to create a sample food chain using the following: grass, snakes, snails, and birds. And then once you've done that, I want you to answer the question, what happens when one link is broken in the food chain? So in this case, the producer, the first thing in the food chain is going to be the grass. The grass is going to be eaten by the snails. The snails are going to be eaten by the snakes, and the snakes will be consumed by the birds. Now, you could always have switched up snakes to birds. There are snakes that eat birds, and then birds do eat snails as well. So you can see how these food chains don't really exist as is in nature, because different things are going to eat different things. But as a very basic idea, this food chain is shown right here. Now, what happens when one link is broken in the food chain? Well, let's just say we killed off all the snails. There were no more snails. Well, now there's no more snails to eat the grass, so the grass population goes up. However, there's no food for the snakes, so the snake population goes down. As a result, the bird population goes down because there's nothing for the birds to eat. So you can see how one break in the food chain significantly affects everything else in that same food chain. Ecological niches. The function of a species serves in its ecosystem is its ecological niche, and it includes what eats it, and how it behaves. No two species occupy identical niches. Each species does its own thing inside an ecosystem. Producers versus consumers. As we mentioned prior, producers are most always plants. So for example, trees, grass, algae, etc. Producers create sugar using energy from the sun. They do not create energy, they create sugar, which then can be converted to energy through cellular respiration. Consumers are living things that eat producers and other consumers. So you can have a producer that's eaten by a consumer, which is eaten by another consumer. So it doesn't need to eat the producer, it can eat a consumer and still be a consumer. Types of consumers. Unlike producers, there are different levels of consumers. Herbivore is an organism that eats plants and other producers. A carnivore is an organism that eats other animals. An omnivore is an organism that eats plants and animals. And a scavenger is an organism that feeds on the remains of other organisms. So things like vultures. They're going to eat the dead carcasses on the side of the road. So herbivores are organisms that eat plants or other producers. So things like giraffes, cows. Carnivores are going to be your animals that eat other animals. So things like your tigers, your sharks, your crocodiles. Omnivores are going to eat both plants and animals. So bears, raccoons, chickens, gorillas, these are omnivores. And then scavengers are going to eat the remains of other dead organisms. So that would include hyenas, vultures, among others. Food chains and trophic levels. The trophic level of an organism in an ecosystem depends on its feeding position along a food chain. The first trophic level is going to be our producers. The second is going to be the primary consumers, and they're the ones that are going to eat producers only. The third trophic level are going to be our secondary consumers, which will eat both primary consumers and producers. And then our fourth trophic level, or our tertiary consumers, will eat secondary consumers, primary consumers, and producers. They're going to eat everyone below them. And that's going to bring us to our food webs. As I mentioned before, food chains don't really exist in nature. They're only good for showing feeding relationships. Food webs show a broader idea of who is going to eat who. So for instance, the grasshopper is going to be eaten by both the frog and the chicken. The chicken is going to be eaten by the snake, and the snake is going to be eaten by the hawk. But you can see how we're not just going to have a linear progression to the hawk. We're going to have a progression that goes to the frog and the chicken, and so on. Food webs are a more accurate display of who eats who. They're a representation of feeding relationships within a community, and they're highly complex, as consumers eat many species. As in food chains, the arrow points from the thing being eaten to the thing eating it. And you can see a more complex example of a food web in the bottom right-hand corner. So in this food web, the sea ducks, that's these guys right there, are eaten by the bald eagle. And we know this because we have an arrow going from the sea ducks to the bald eagle. But what three animals eat all the plants? Our plants are down here. We have our phytoplankton, our submerged aquatic vegetation, and our vegetation. So what three animals eat all the plants? Well, you're going to have your geese and moot swans, your herbivorous ducks, your benthic invertebrates, and the small planktivorous fish. Food webs are very useful in figuring out what may happen when a species is removed from or added to an ecosystem. If a species is removed, the number of animals that would normally eat it would decrease. So why would that be? Well, as we mentioned before, in the example of the grass being eaten by the snail, if we remove the grass, now there's no food for the snail to eat. So as a result, the snail population is going to go down. The introduction of new species can also dramatically alter the food web as new feeding relationships are established. So what happened if the small planktivorous fish was removed? So again, that's that guy right there. What would happen if you removed the phytoplankton? That's this guy right here. So if we remove the small planktivorous fish, what's going to happen is that the phytoplankton that it eats is going to go up in population, as is the population of the zooplankton, because the thing that eats it is not going to be there anymore. Now, what three species eat the small planktivorous fish? We have this guy, and this guy. So if we remove that species, these three populations are going to go down. Now, if we remove the phytoplankton, the species that eat it are also going to go down. So the small planktivorous fish, that population is going to go down. The benthic invertebrates, they're going to go down. And the bivalves, they're going to go down as well. So things that consume the phytoplankton are going to decrease in population size because the food source is no longer there. Ecological pyramids. Ecological pyramids display feeding relationships between trophic levels in ecosystems. There are three main types of ecological pyramids, including energy, biomass, and numbers. In an energy pyramid, we're taking a look at how energy is distributed among the feeding relationships. It shows our energy loss and transfer between our trophic levels. The size of each layer represents the amount of energy available at that trophic level. Only about 10% of the energy taken in by individuals at one trophic level is passed on to the individuals in the next trophic level. So if we have 100% in primary producers, we're only going to have 10% available to the primary consumers. Of that 10%, only 10% is passed on, therefore there's only 1% available to the secondary consumers, and so on all the way up. But where does the rest of the energy go? Well, it leaves as heat. At each trophic level, the bulk of the energy received from the previous level is used by the organism who obtained it. That's to do things like move around. When that organism moves around, it's going to burn that energy and create a byproduct of heat. And as a result, less and less energy is available as we move up the pyramid. So as our primary producers survive, they are going to need to undergo cellular respiration and do some kind of action that's going to consume some of that energy. As a result, they're going to give a good deal of that off as heat. Same thing with the primary consumers. They're going to be moving around. They're going to be burning that energy. They're not just going to take in X amount of energy and then pass that same amount to the next people that eat it. They're going to burn some of that energy off. And as a result, 90% of that is given off as heat through a product of cellular respiration, and so on, all the way up the pyramid. Our second is our biomass pyramid. This represents the mass or weight of all the living organisms within that trophic level. So in our first trophic level, we're going to have the most mass, then we're going to have our second most mass, third most, all the way up the pyramid. And you can see how it gets less and less and less. So there's less biomass at the top of the ecological pyramid than there was at the bottom. And then lastly, we have numbers pyramid, and it represents the number of organisms that make up each trophic level. It's similar, but not the same as the biomass pyramid. In a forest ecosystem, the tiny plant-feeding insects in the second trophic level, that's this guy right here. The decomposers are right at the bottom because they're going to break everything down. But since the trees aren't actually eating the decomposers, we're going to assume this is the first, the second, the third, and the fourth trophic level going upwards. And you can see that the number of insects is significantly more than the number of trees. Its section is larger, it's wider. So it doesn't look exactly like the biomass pyramid, which gets smaller as you go up, but it does generally get smaller as it goes up. There's just a couple sections where potentially there could be more individuals, even though they have less mass overall. Because even if there's more insects, the mass of those insects is not going to be nearly as much as the mass of the trees that it feeds on. And that concludes our lesson on energy flow in ecosystems.